Okay, we're ready to begin. Sivav. Mitzvah saseh ala gezel, lahachzer Gezeilah atzma, im hi beinav v'lo nishtanis. There's a mitzvah saseh, a mitzvah in Torah, for one who steals to return the object that they stole, as long as the object is intact and unchanged. Meaning that a gazlan is not able to pay restitution, is not able to pay off the victim to pay the money for the value of what they stole. They have to, if the object that they stole is still in existence and is still intact, then there is a chiyuv to return the actual object. We just began Sivav. Shenemar v'heshev Gezeilah asher gazel. Like the pasuk says, the pasuk in Torah, v'heshev Gezeilah asher gazel. You have to return the Gezeilah asher gazel, not the value of the Gezeilah asher gazel in money, but the actual Gezeilah asher gazel. V'adin leganev, and it's the same thing. Even though the Torah speaks about a gazlan, the same halacha applies to a ganev. A ganev also has to return the actual object that he stole. And he does not fulfill his obligation by giving money, by paying off the value of the object that he stole, even if the original owners, the victims of the theft, were already meyayish, they already gave up the spirit of ever recovering the object that was stolen from them. So you might think that, okay, so yiyush, so they don't want it back anyway, or they give up of getting it back anyway. So it could be that the ownership, so to speak, transferred to the gazlan, and now he's able to repair his gzela by paying off the money. Says the halacha is no, even though there was yush, that is not enough, and as long as the object is still intact and unchanged, then it has to be returned as is. Aval im avda, but if it got lost, or it underwent a change, not just any change, irreversible change, a change that cannot be undone. So in other words, it is no longer the original object that was stolen, it's something else, or the original object that was stolen was lost. So in that case, then the gazlan fulfills his obligation of v'heshev Gezeilah, of returning the object that he stole by giving money. If the person, the victim, the person who was stolen from, is somewhere else, the gazlan does not have to send the money to him. He just informs him that I'm here, and this is what I stole from you, and I'm ready to pay it back, and you can come pick it up whenever you're ready. So what this sif is teaching us, in the first 5 sifim we learned that there's an issue of Gezeilah, and there are different prati dinim in Gezeilah, what constitutes Gezeilah, and other details as discussed at length in previous shiur, comes over here in Sifav and tells us that after all is said and done, there's a mitzvah v'heshev Gezeilah, to return the Gezeilah. Now, we learned already in Sif Aleph, and we discussed many times, that there's an isser to steal even from a non-Jew. Regarding the mitzvah of hashavas Gezeilah to a non-Jew, so the Rambam in Hilchos Gezeilah, Perek Aleph Halacha Beis, writes beferish, v'im gazli ay ashke yachzer. If somebody steals from a guy, or they withheld payment from a guy, which is Aisha, as we discussed previously, Yachzer, he has to return. So there is an obligation to return a Gezeilah even to a non-Jew. However, over here we're learning that it's a mitzvah deraisa, v'heshev Gezeilah. However, the Neidu Yehuda in Neidu Yehuda Kama in Yeridei and Sim Pei Aleph, he writes that even though the Rambam says that somebody who stole from a guy has to return it, nevertheless, says the Neidu Yehuda, it's not part of the mitzvah menateri v'heshev Gezeilah. There's an obligation to return it. It's an obligation midei Rabbonim, but it's not part of the mitzvah menateri v'heshev Gezeilah. Then he goes further, And we're going to see that the Neder B'Yehuda is going to present three approaches to understanding the Salach and the Rambam. One, he says there is an obligation, but it's not a mitzvah min HaTorah. Another way, he says, even if you want to say that the Rambam is saying that it's a chiyuv min HaTorah, it's still not veheshev. It's a chiyuv min HaTorah, but it's not a mitzvah saseh of veheshev Gezeilah. But then he says, really, he thinks it's only a mitzvah midrabanan. But min HaTorah, he says, there's no source that says min HaTorah you have to return a Gezeilah to a non-Jew. And then he says, even if you want to say, what does it mean that there's that in the first way we said that there's a mitzvah, that there's an obligation min HaTorah, but it's not a mitzvah saseh v'heshev Gezeilah. So the Neder B'Yehuda explains. He says the Gemara tells us kol mad avad rachmana kol mad amar rachmana lo yisaved yavad li mehani. The Torah tells you can't do something, so if you do it, it's not effective. So the Torah says don't steal. So when you stole something, it wasn't effective to transfer ownership of that object from its original owner to you, even if it was a guy. So therefore, every moment that you hold on to it, you continue to be ever an isser of leisigzel. So in order to stop that, you have to return it. But there's no mitzvah saseh v'heshev Gezeilah. So to summarize, he gives the Neder B'Yehuda gives a few different ways of understanding the Rambam, whether the obligation of returning a Gezeilah to a guy is deraisa or derabanan. It's mashma that the Neder B'Yehuda himself understands that the Rambam he understands mainly that it's an issa derabanan. Yeah, that it's a mitzvah, that it's a chiyuv miderabanan. The Ramah in Even HaEzer in Siman Chavches, the Neder B'Yehuda brings us, and it seems to be mashma from the Ramah over there that it's also a chiyuv miderabanan, because the Ramah over there says as follows. The Mechaber says, "Hamakadosh seisha begazalei begniva bechamas im nesiyah shabaylam v'neidah shakana isidavar b'yeush harizu mikudashes v'imlav eina mikudashes." One who is mekadosh a woman with a stolen object. Yeah, one of the ways that Kesef shtarabia, kesef has to be, you could be mekadosh a woman with kesef, but it has to be kesef that belongs to you. If you're mekadosh a woman with gzeila, so it doesn't belong to you, so the kedushin are ineffective. However, if we're going to see later in the Alter Rebbe in Sifid Aleph that once there is yeyosh and once the owners give up on ever getting the object back, and with some other considerations, then it could be considered as if the Gazlan actually takes ownership of the object of the object. He still has to pay it back, but he can pay back money. But the object itself he would own, and he could be mekadesh with that object. So that's the halach in the Mechaber. Says the Ramah, Kidsha begezel uGeneivas akum havim mekudashes. Somebody who is mekadesh a woman with something that was stolen from a guy, she's mekudashes. Because there is no chiyuv min HaTorah to return it. You can't be mekadesh with a stolen object because you have a chiyuv to return it, so it doesn't belong to you. But something that's stolen from a guy, there is no chiyuv min HaTorah to return it. There's only midirabanan a chiyuv because of kiddush Hashem, a potential chil Hashem. So therefore, the kiddushin would be valid in such a case, and that's how the Neder B'Yehuda understands the Rama. That's also how the Nesivus understands the Rama in Siman Shin Mem Ches. However, there are those who understand the opinion of certain achronim to say that the chiyuv hashava of hashavas gzeila by a guy is midiraisa, but apparently the consensus of most poskim is that it's midirabanan. Okay. Now, in the Shiloh Meshiv, the Shiloh Sitruvis, he has a nice explanation that he says to explain this, and he starts off by talking about something that we discussed previously, which is about deceiving a guy. So there's the machlekes we learned. There's a machlekes if you're allowed to take advantage of a guy's mistake, and there's a machlekes if you're allowed to actively deceive a guy, or it's only if the guy makes a mistake on his own. If you can take advantage of that mistake, we learned that the Alter Rebbe is machmer. But in any case, there is a machlekes. So the Shiloh Meshiv says as follows. He says he speaks about this machlekes, and he says, really, we have to understand, because the Marshal, who we mentioned once, he learns that there is no Isser Midaraisa of stealing from a guy. He explains why. The Torah is given only to Yidden. So how can there be an Isser Midaraisa of stealing from a guy? So the Chacham Tzvi argues in the Marshal, and he says, has nothing to do with the guy. The Torah commands us not to steal. It doesn't make a difference if it's from a guy, if it's from someone else. It's not an appropriate thing for a yid to do. So he says the Shalom Eshiv. Based on that, we have to understand, if it's something that it doesn't matter, it doesn't make a difference who you're stealing from, because it's something that the Torah does not allow, that doesn't want you to steal. It's not something that the Torah wants you to do. So how come Hafkas Halva, withholding payment from a guy, what we learned in the previous year, that's mutter? So the whole it has nothing to do with it, according to what we just said. It has nothing to do with who the victim is, if it's a yid or a guy. It has to do with the yid. You're not supposed to do avlis. You're not supposed to do things that are taking advantage of other people. So he says, very simple. There's a difference between actively doing something and passively doing something. When you're actively stealing, that the Torah doesn't allow you to do, even if it's from a guy. But the passively, something already came. Hafkas halvad. A guy lends you money. That was a legitimate transaction. Now you're not doing anything. You're just being mafki alva. So there's no iser mitzad the guy, because the Torah was given to you, not the guy, and there's no iser mitzad the yid because you're not doing anything. You're being passive. He says, based on that, we can understand also the opinion in Acharim that Hashavas Gezeilah does not apply to Gezeilah V'Goy. And he says, again, the same thing. The Gezeilah, you weren't allowed to do that, Taka, that was Asr. But once it happened, it already happened. So therefore, the Torah doesn't require you, according to this, but Torah doesn't require you to go and return it to a guy, because now whatever's happening is passive.
Hey, du bist aqui.
So, yeah, so that's how he explains it. I just want to point out that, as we discussed previously, according to the Alter Rebbe, there is a difference between Hafkas Halva and Hafkas Bikadin. You're allowed to, it's permitted to withhold payment of a loan to a guy, but it's not permitted to withhold giving back a guy an actual object that is intact, that exists, that belongs to a guy. According to the way the Shalom Eshiv is explaining, it shouldn't make a difference, because as long as it already happened, my dahava have, he says, and whatever is from now on is passive. So the Torah did not. The Torah was not makbid in such a case. So it seems like according to the Alter Rebbe, it doesn't really shtim. Just putting that out there. Based on everything we discussed, we can also think about something that happens, which is a person checks into a hotel or an Airbnb, and needless to say, it's usher to steal anything from a hotel or an Airbnb actively, even if it's owned by a guy. But what happens is sometimes you get home and you realize by mistake you took a towel or something else. So it seems like, according to all opinions, would be an obligation to return it, either according to some Acharim, it's mamash mitzvah min ateri v'heshav Gezeilah, or if it's a chil Hashem. Although we can say that according to those who learned that it's because of Kiddush Hashem or Chil Hashem, that in such a situation where it won't really Kiddush Hashem is not really shaykh, so maybe takanat. Or like what we mentioned from the Neidu Yehuda earlier, and even the Shalom Eshiv
it shows online.
brings this svara, and he agrees with it, that as long as the object remains in your possession, so maybe there's no mitzvah of a heshav segzela, there's no mitzvah to return, but every moment that you're not returning it, you continue to be ever and sigzil. So I don't really see anyone who talks about this beferish, but again, just putting there something to think about based on as a practical scenario based on what we're learning. Another point is that we mentioned in Sif Aleph that over here the Alter Rebbe says mitzvah say ala Gezeilah hachzer hagzeila atzma. And there is a mitzvah to return the actual Gzeilah. Just to point out that in Sif Aleph we already learned that this all applies to a Gzeilah that is worth more than a Shava Pruta. But Pachis Mishava Pruta in a Nikra Moment ve'ein tzarich lashev. Somebody who steals less than a Shava Pruta is not required to return it. There is no mitzvah v'heshav as Gzeilah on a Gzeilah that's less than a Shava Pruta. This isn't very common, but that is the halach. Now, what are the exceptions that we learned? When do you not have to return the Gzeilah itself? One is possible to be exempt just by paying money. If it was changed, an irreversible change. So there are at least 3 examples of this discussed elsewhere in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. The first place is in Hilchos Tzitzis, in Siman Yud Aleph, Siman Yud Aleph, Sif Yud Beis, the Alter Rebbe says as follows. The halacha is that one is not yetza with the mitzvah of tzitzis with stolen tzitzis, because the pasuk says v'asu lachem tzitzis. Tzitzis have to belong to you. So says the Alter Rebbe in Siman Yud Aleph, Gazal Tzemer Shaloi Nitva Utvana Gazal L'Shem Tzitzis, somebody who stole wool that was not spun, and then the Gazlan spun the wool into tzitzis. If the owners still were not miyash, then they're puzzle for tzitzis. Because they are still considered gazel. They don't belong to the gazel at all. He's obligated to return them as they are. He was not kind of them by spinning wool into threads, because that is a reversible change. It's possible to unspin the wool, to take it, to unspin the threads back into wool. You're able to unravel them and make them back into wool. But if the owners were already miyash, or even if they weren't miyash, but the gazlan made an irreversible change to the wool, like he, for example, whitened, bleached the wool begafris, which is sulfur. Since by effecting an irreversible change on this wool, so then the gazlan is koinet. Even if the wool is still intact and still in existence, he no longer is required to return the actual wool to the nigzel, to the victim. Rather, he's able to pay back the value of the wool that was originally stolen. Therefore, the tzitzis that were made out of this stolen wool, and then he made an irreversible change on the wool, are kosher. However, one should not make a bracha on such tzitzis. One is not making a bracha, one is not blessing Hashem, he is he's angering Hashem. Since the tzitzis only came into his possession through Gzeilah. That's one example. Another place is in Siman Taf Nun Daled in Hilchos Pesach. Again, similar halacha. One is not yetza the mitzvah of eating matzah with stolen matzahs. So says the Alter Rebbe over there, Ein Adam yetzu deichav ela b'matzah shaloi. But if he stole matzah and he ate matzah lo yatza, he's not yetza. Why? Because if the nigzel, if the victim comes and demands, give me back the matzahs, he has to give them back. And he's not able to say, wait, let me keep the matzahs and I'll give you money. The halacha is v'heshav as gzeilah shar gazel. You have to return the actual gzeilah, the actual object that was stolen. So nimtzis she'eino shaloi, it comes out that this matzah doesn't belong to you. Bamed varim amurim kesha gazal matzah. That only applies when you stole matzah. But if somebody stole flour and made matzah out of the flour, then he's yaitza, because you can't turn matzah back into flour. It's an irreversible change. Because if the nigzel comes in and he says, "Give me my flour back," he says, "I don't have it anymore. I made it into matzah." He says, "Okay, give me the matzahs." You don't have to give him the matzahs. You only have to give him the value of the flour that was stolen. The Gazlan was already kinda the Gazela by performing an irreversible change on the flour. And it's as if it mamish belongs to him. And therefore, one is able to be yitzah with such matches, with these matzahs, and the Alter Rebbe also over here concludes that nevertheless one should not make a bracha on these matzahs. You can make a bracha ala chilas matzah, because even though technically one could be yitzah the mitzvah with these matzahs, but to make a bracha is not mevarich, it's menoitz, and it's inappropriate to make a bracha. And similarly, not going to read it inside, but in Siman Taf Reish Mem Tes in Hilchos Lulav, again, as we know, lulav agazel, one is not yitzah with a stolen lulav. L'kachtem lachem, it has to belong to you. It's the same halacha if somebody stole a lulav and performed an irreversible change on the lulav, meaning stole a palm branch and turned it into a lulav, then he is able to be yitzah the mitzvah with it, because he was kaina the lulav by performing a change on it. Nevertheless, one should not make a bracha on such a lulav. However, all of this is when the object was changed. Somebody made an irreversible change on the object, so therefore the Gazlan acquires it, and he's able to use it to perform, technically, it could be yaitza certain mitzvahs with it, and it's as if it belongs to him and is able to pay back money. However, if the Gzeilah, the object, is unchanged, the halacha is that you have to return the object as is. Minat Torah, Shulchan Aruch says, "Afilu gazal kaira ubna bebira g'dayla." Somebody stole a beam, and they built that beam into a building. The beam is unchanged. It's exactly as it was when it was stolen, but it's now part of a larger structure. Since it's not changed, din Torah sheyaris kolabin in v'yachzer kaira labaylo. According Minat Torah, in order to fulfill the mitzvah of a hishav as a gzela, somebody has to, the Gazlan has to tear down the building and return the object to the owner. Aval tiknu chachamim mipnei takanas hashavim she'anoisen estameh v'lo yafsit habinin. However, Chazal realized that if you're going to require people to do this, nobody's ever going to do tshuva, because it's one thing to return something, it's another thing to tear down an entire building, an entire structure, to return one beam. So therefore, Chazal were masakin that in such a case, you can pay back the money and you don't have to destroy the entire building. Moreover, the Alter Rebbe writes in Siman Taf Reish Lamed Zayin and Hilchos Sukkah, and the Mechaber also over there writes the same halacha in Siman Taf Reish Lamed Zayin, and also over here in Chesed Mishpat in Siman Shin Samach. I'm going to read the Alter Rebbe's lashon. Im gazal etzim v'tzikich behem sukkah. If somebody stole branches and used them as schach, even though he did not attach them to his sukkah, he only schach are not attached; they're placed on top of the sukkah. And he did not make any change in the branches. In other words, any other time of the year, the halacha would be that you have to return them as is. Because he wasn't kind of them at all, he did not create any change in the branches. Because of the mitzvah of Sukkah, Rashi explains the Masech Sukkah, and the Smeh brings it here in Chesed Mishpat, that because the cheshivas of the mitzvah. The cheshivas of the mitzvah, the mitzvah of sukkah gives it a certain kvius. It's as if it's built into a building that the Chazal were not mechayiv you to tear down the entire building in order to return one beam. So too, Chazal did not require you to take your schach off your sukkah, because it's as if it was built into a permanent structure. Rather, you still have to pay back, and you have to pay back right away. You have to pay back the value of the branches that were stolen. And one is allowed to sit and be mekayim the mitzvah in the sukkah, even lechatchila. In other words, it's mashma that you could even make a bracha. But if the gazlan refuses to give back even the value of the branches of the schach, then he's not yetze by sitting in the sukkah because it's stolen. Chazal said, "Takanas hashavim, you don't have to take apart your sukkah and give them back. You can pay back the money, but you have to pay back. If you refuse to pay back even the money, even the value, then it can't be yetze. It's a stolen sukkah." And sukkah also has to be chaga sukkah stasa lecha. Has to be lecha, has to belong to you. Right. So to summarize, minatera, something that's stolen, that's unchanged, has to be returned as is. Chazal were masakin that if you built it into a permanent structure, you don't have to tear down the entire building in order to return one stolen beam. You can pay back the value of the beam that was stolen in cash. Moreover, it's not only by a permanent structure, even by a temporary structure. In other words, a sukkah. Even by a sukkah, you don't have to take down your sukkah to return the stolen schach. This only applies to a sukkah. If it would be another temporary structure, this halacha would not apply. And even by a sukkah, if he's not coming on sukkahs, if he's coming after sukkahs, and he demands his and he asks for his branches back, then the gazlan has to return them as they are and is obligated to take down the sukkah because there's no more mitzvah. This halacha comes up in a practical way when somebody is traveling and they want to make a sukkah somewhere in a park or in public. So besides for the another issue of making a sukkah on public property, which halacha is that even though you're yetzer, you shouldn't make a bracha in such a sukkah. But when you take the schach, the schach have to be taken. If you don't bring your own schach, you can only take schach from hefker. But to take schach from that belong to someone else, even if it's from a guy, so that's so those schach are stolen, and okay, you for sure can't do it because it's stealing. Even b'diavad, one who is over on gazela and stole schach and made a sukkah is only yotze if they have in mind, if they have the intention to pay back the value of the schach. But if they have no intention, if the lashon is if he's not interested in giving back the me'etzim, then he's not yetze in such a sukkah, because it is a stolen sukkah. To end off with one final point, the last second paragraph here in Sevav, if the victim of the theft is somewhere else, then the gazlan does not have to run after him. He has to run after him to inform him. He has to send him a message to inform him that this is where I am, this is what I stole from you, this is what I have, and come get it. But he doesn't have to run after him to return it to him. There's a machlekes shach and smeh in Siman Shin Samach Zayin. The smeh says that this is also takanas hashavim. This is midirabanan, meaning, strictly speaking, one would be required to run after the gazlan to return what they stole, but because of takanas hashavim, you're not required to. However, the shach over there argues and it says me'ikar din, you don't have to run after him unless the halacha is if the gazlan made a shvuah and denying the theft, then once he made the shvuah, if he then wants to do tshuva and return what he stole, then he is required to run after and find and not rest until he returns the stolen object into the hands of the original owners. However, you know, in a normal case where he didn't make a shvua, then he's not obligated to run after the owners to return the object. And the Shach says even losses yidei shamayim, you don't have to. The Aruch HaShulchan says that this is what he says. This halacha applies when the theft took place here in New York, and then the nigzel, the victim, he went somewhere else. So the halacha is that the gazlan doesn't have to run after the nigzel to a different place from that isn't where the original gazela took place. That's what the halacha is referring to here. However, if the gazlan went somewhere else, then he has to come back to the original place where the gazela took place and where the victim is, where the nigzel is, and return it to him. Okay, that's what the Aruch HaShulchan says. Obviously, the Alter Rebbe over here is not mechalik, and Shulchan Aruch are not mechalik. So we'll leave it as that. And that concludes Sif Vav, which is where we'll stop for today. Be'ezus Hashem next week. Continue with Sif Zayin.